Jacob Miller spent his last $7 on a massive black horse that had already put 2 trainers in the hospital, while the bank's foreclosure notice sat waiting on his kitchen table. 3 days later, that same killer horse did something that made a millionaire beg to buy him for $200,000. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning air was thick with tension as Jacob Miller stood at the edge of the county fairgrounds, his weathered hands gripping the 7 crumpled dollar bills he had found in his coat pocket that morning. At 63 years old, Jacob had seen better days. His small farm in rural Kentucky had been hanging by a thread for the past 2 years, ever since the drought had devastated his corn crop and taken with it any hope of financial recovery. The bank had already sent 3 notices about the mortgage, and his wife Martha had been rationing their meals to make ends meet. But today, despite everything, Jacob had come to the bankruptcy auction with a strange feeling in his gut, a feeling he couldn't quite explain. The auctioneer's voice cracked through the loudspeaker, announcing the next item. Jacob watched as a crowd gathered near the livestock pen, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. He pushed his way through the mass of bodies, his heart beginning to race as he caught his first glimpse of what had drawn everyone's attention. There, in the center of the pen, stood the most magnificent and terrifying horse Jacob had ever seen. The animal was massive, standing at least 18 hands high, with a coat as black as midnight and muscles that rippled beneath his skin like coiled steel. His eyes were wild, rolling white with fear and fury, and his nostrils flared with each aggressive snort. The horse reared up suddenly, his powerful hooves slashing through the air as 3 men struggled to control him with thick ropes. One of the handlers stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding a devastating kick that could have crushed his skull. The crowd gasped and stepped back instinctively. Jacob heard someone mutter that the horse was a killer, that he had already injured 2 trainers at the racing stable where he had been kept. Another voice added that the previous owner had gone bankrupt trying to break the animal's spirit, spending thousands on professional trainers who had all failed and walked away. Now the horse was being sold for whatever anyone was willing to pay, just to get rid of him before someone got killed. Jacob should have walked away, any sensible man would have. He had no business buying a horse, especially not one with a reputation for violence. He could barely afford to feed himself and Martha, let alone a massive animal that ate more in a day than they did in a week. But something stopped him from leaving. As the horse reared again, Jacob's eyes met the animal's gaze for just a moment, and in that brief connection, he saw something that no one else seemed to notice. Beneath the rage and the fear, there was pain, deep, soul-crushing pain. The kind Jacob recognized because he carried it himself every day. The auctioneer began the bidding, starting optimistically at $500. The crowd remained silent. No one wanted to take on the liability. The price dropped to $300, then $200, then $100. Still, no hands went up. Jacob watched as the auctioneer's face grew frustrated, his voice taking on a desperate edge. $50, he called out. Surely someone would pay $50 for a horse of this size and breeding, even if he was difficult. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of the horse's angry snorts and the shuffle of feet as people began to drift away, looking for more promising lots to bid on. $25, the auctioneer announced, his voice now tinged with resignation. Jacob felt his hand begin to rise as if it had a will of its own. He tried to stop it, tried to remind himself of all the reasons this was insane, but his arm continued upward. $10, the auctioneer said, and now there was almost pleading in his tone. This magnificent animal, this powerful creature, being sold for the price of a cheap meal. Jacob's voice emerged before his brain could stop it. $7, he heard himself say, the words barely above a whisper but somehow carrying across the suddenly quiet fairground. The auctioneer's eyes found Jacob in the crowd, widening with a mixture of relief and disbelief. $7, he repeated. Do I hear 8? The silence was deafening. Going once, the auctioneer called out, going twice. His gavel hung in the air for a long moment, giving anyone a final chance to save Jacob from his own foolishness, but no one spoke. Sold, the auctioneer declared, bringing the gavel down with a sharp crack. To the gentleman in the blue flannel shirt for $7, the crowd parted as Jacob made his way to the payment table, their faces showing a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. He could hear the whispers following him. That poor fool has no idea what he just bought. That horse will kill him before the week is out. He should have let them send it to the slaughterhouse where it belongs. Jacob ignored them all, his hands trembling slightly as he counted out his $7 onto the table. The clerk gave him a long look, as if trying to determine whether Jacob was drunk or simply out of his mind, before sliding a bill of sale across the counter. Now came the hard part. Jacob approached the pen where 3 burly men still struggled to control the massive horse. When they saw him coming, one of them laughed, a bitter sound without humor. You the idiot who bought this devil? The man asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Good luck getting him home. We've been trying to load him into a trailer for 2 hours. He nearly killed Jimmy here when we tried to put a halter on him. Jacob looked at the horse, who had backed into the far corner of the pen, his ears pinned flat against his head and his eyes showing nothing but white around the edges. Jacob had no trailer. He had no halter. He had no plan at all for how he was going to get this terrified, aggressive animal back to his farm 10 miles away. What he did have was $7 less than he had started the day with, a wife who would probably question his sanity when he got home, and a horse that everyone agreed was too dangerous to live. As he stood there, watching the animal tremble with rage and fear in the corner of that pen, Jacob wondered if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had no way of knowing that in 3 days, this $7 horse would do something that would change everything he thought he knew about second chances, about redemption, and about the true meaning of trust. Jacob stood outside the pen for what felt like an eternity, studying the massive black horse who glared back at him with undisguised hostility. The 3 handlers had given up trying to help and had moved on to other lots, muttering good riddance under their breath as they left. Jacob was alone now, separated from his $7 purchase by nothing more than a few wooden rails and an ocean of mutual distrust. He could feel the eyes of lingering spectators on his back, waiting to see what the old fool would do next. Some had even pulled out their phones, ready to record what they assumed would be either spectacular entertainment or a tragic accident. Taking a slow breath, Jacob climbed over the fence and dropped into the pen. The horse immediately reared up, his front hooves pawing the air in warning. Jacob froze but didn't retreat. He had worked with animals his entire life, and while he had never encountered anything quite like this black giant, he understood one fundamental truth that the expensive trainers had apparently forgotten. Fear couldn't be broken with force. It had to be met with patience. He took one small step forward, then stopped. The horse snorted and tossed his massive head, the muscles in his neck bunching with tension. Jacob took another step, moving slowly, deliberately, keeping his body language as non-threatening as possible. For 20 minutes, Jacob advanced inch by inch across the pen while the horse retreated, maintaining the distance between them. They moved in a strange dance, predator and prey, though Jacob wasn't entirely sure which role he was playing. His knees ached from the tension, and sweat trickled down his back despite the cool autumn air. He could hear someone in the crowd say that this was pointless, that he should just call animal control and have the beast put down, but Jacob kept moving, kept his eyes soft, kept his breathing steady. He began to speak, his voice low and rhythmic, talking about nothing in particular. He told the horse about his farm, about the creek that ran through the back pasture, about the old oak tree where Martha liked to sit on summer evenings. The horse's ears, which had been pinned flat against his skull, flickered forward slightly. It was such a small change that anyone else might have missed it. but Jacob saw it and felt a spark of hope kindle in his chest. He kept talking, kept moving with that same glacial slowness. He told the horse about the drought, about the bills piling up on the kitchen table, about how he had come to this auction not knowing why, just feeling pulled here by something he couldn't name. The horse stopped retreating. He stood in the corner, still trembling, still ready to explode into violence, but he had stopped running. Jacob moved one step closer, then extended his hand, palm down, fingers relaxed. The horse's nostrils flared as he scented the air, trying to determine what threat this strange man posed. Minutes passed. Jacob's arm began to ache from holding it extended, but he didn't move. Finally, with a hesitation so profound it was almost painful to watch, the horse stretched his neck forward and touched his nose to Jacob's fingertips. The contact lasted only a second before the horse jerked back, but it was enough. Jacob felt tears sting his eyes, though he couldn't have explained why that brief touch had communicated more than words ever could. The horse wasn't aggressive by nature, he was terrified. Building on that tiny moment of trust, Jacob spent the next hour simply standing in the pen, talking softly, occasionally extending his hand for the horse to investigate. The crowd eventually dispersed, disappointed that no one was getting trampled or kicked. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and Jacob's stomach reminded him that he hadn't eaten breakfast, but he stayed, patient as stone, waiting for the horse to take the next step. And slowly, incrementally, the massive animal began to relax. His breathing slowed. The wild rolling of his eyes subsided. He even took a few steps toward Jacob voluntarily, drawn by curiosity, or perhaps by the calm certainty in the old farmer's voice. When Jacob finally felt confident enough to try touching more than just the horse's nose, he moved with exquisite care. He laid his hand on the horse's massive neck, feeling the powerful muscles twitch beneath the skin. The horse froze, every fiber of his being ready to bolt or fight, but Jacob kept his touch light and gentle, murmuring reassurance. He stroked the sleek black coat, working his way slowly along the neck toward the shoulder. The horse shuddered but didn't pull away. Jacob could feel the rapid hammering of the animal's heart, could sense the war being waged between instinct and the fragile thread of trust they were building together. The real test came when Jacob reached for the lead rope one of the handlers had abandoned in the dirt. The horse's eyes widened, showing white again, and he took several quick steps backward. Jacob knew this was a critical moment. The rope represented everything the horse feared, all the rough handling and failed attempts to dominate him through force. Jacob picked up the rope slowly, making no sudden movements, and simply held it in his hands. He didn't try to approach the horse with it. He just stood there, letting the animal see that the rope was just an object, nothing more. After several long minutes, Jacob took one end of the rope and fashioned it into a simple loop, then laid it on the ground between them. He stepped back and waited. The horse stared at the rope as if it were a coiled snake. Then, in a moment that would replay in Jacob's mind for the rest of his life, the horse took one tentative step forward and lowered his head to sniff the rope. Jacob's heart soared. This was breakthrough. This was the first time the horse had chosen to approach something that frightened him rather than running from it. Jacob picked up the rope again, moving with the same careful deliberateness. And this time, when he approached the horse, the animal stood his ground. With hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and emotion, Jacob slipped the loop over the horse's massive head. The transformation wasn't complete. The horse still tensed, still radiated barely controlled panic. But he didn't rear. He didn't lash out. He stood there, sides heaving, and let Jacob hold the rope. It was surrender and trust intertwined, a gift more valuable than anything Jacob could have purchased with money. The walk home began in the late afternoon, with the sun already beginning its descent toward the horizon. Jacob held the rope loosely in his hands, giving the horse enough slack to feel free, but maintaining just enough contact to provide gentle guidance. They moved at a pace that could barely be called walking, more like a series of careful negotiations between each step. The 10-mile journey to Jacob's farm would normally take about 3 hours on foot, but Jacob understood that with this frightened giant beside him, they would be lucky to make it home before midnight. The first real challenge came at the edge of the fairgrounds, where the gravel road began. The horse planted his massive hooves and refused to move forward, his entire body going rigid with suspicion. Jacob didn't pull on the rope or try to force the issue. Instead, he simply stopped and waited, standing beside the horse rather than in front of him. They remained frozen like that for nearly 20 minutes while cars occasionally passed, their drivers slowing down to stare at the strange sight of an old man and a terrified horse locked in a standoff at the roadside. Jacob used the time to continue talking, his voice a steady stream of calm reassurance that seemed to have become his primary tool for reaching this damaged soul. When the horse finally took that first tentative step onto the gravel, Jacob felt a surge of triumph that was quickly tempered by the realization of how many more steps lay ahead. The sound of the gravel crunching beneath the horse's hooves made him nervous, his ears swiveling constantly to track every noise. A truck rumbled past, and the horse shied violently to the side, nearly pulling the rope from Jacob's hands. But Jacob held firm, not with force but with steady presence, becoming an anchor point in a world that clearly terrified this magnificent creature. "Easy now," Jacob murmured. "Nothing here is going to hurt you, I promise you that." They walked through the afternoon, pausing frequently when the horse needed time to process some new sight or sound. A dog barking from behind a fence sent the horse into a nervous dance, his hooves striking sparks from the pavement. A plastic bag blowing across the road might as well have been a mountain lion for the way it triggered a full-body flinch. Each time, Jacob stopped and waited, talking constantly, his voice becoming hoarse but never losing its gentle quality. He found himself sharing things with this horse that he had never told another living soul, confessions that poured out of him in the growing twilight. He talked about the shame of failure, about watching his farm slowly die despite his best efforts, about the crushing weight of knowing he might lose everything his father and grandfather had built. The horse's breathing gradually synchronized with Jacob's own, and somewhere around the 5th mile something shifted between them. The massive animal began walking closer to Jacob, close enough that their bodies occasionally touched. It wasn't quite trust, not yet, but it was something. A recognition, perhaps, one broken thing acknowledging another. Jacob felt it in his bones, that wordless understanding that sometimes forms between beings who have both known suffering. They were both survivors, both struggling to keep moving forward when every instinct screamed to give up. As darkness fell, Jacob began to worry about Martha. She would be frantic by now, wondering where he had gone. They had no cell phone because they couldn't afford one, and he had left that morning without telling her about his strange compulsion to attend the auction. She would have fixed dinner hours ago, would have paced the kitchen floor, would perhaps have even called their neighbor Tom to ask if he had seen Jacob's truck. The guilt gnawed at him, but he couldn't move any faster without risking the fragile connection he had built with the horse. They passed through the small town of Millbrook just as the streetlights flickered on. The few people still out on the streets stopped to stare at the unlikely pair. Jacob recognized old Bill Henderson standing outside the feed store, his jaw dropping open when he saw the massive black horse. Bill called out something, probably asking if Jacob had lost his mind, but Jacob just waved and kept walking. He knew what they all thought. Crazy old Jacob Miller buying a dangerous horse with money he didn't have, walking at home in the dark like some kind of fool. Let them think what they wanted. They didn't understand what he had seen in that auction pen, that flash of recognition when his eyes had met the horse's gaze. The last 3 miles were the hardest. Jacob's feet ached in his worn boots, and his legs trembled with exhaustion. He hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the $7 he had spent on the horse meant there was no money left for even a cup of coffee. But the horse seemed to sense his fatigue and moved closer still, his massive body providing warmth against the chill of the October night. At one point, Jacob stumbled on a crack in the pavement, and the horse stopped immediately, waiting until Jacob had regained his balance before moving forward again. It was such a small gesture of consideration, but it brought fresh tears to Jacob's eyes. When they finally turned onto the long dirt driveway that led to the Miller farm, Jacob saw the lights blazing in every window of the small farmhouse. Martha must have been beside herself with worry. He could see her silhouette moving behind the kitchen curtain, probably watching the road as she had been doing for hours. The horse balked again at the sight of the unfamiliar buildings, but Jacob stroked his neck and kept walking, trusting that the animal would follow. And he did, step by hesitant step, until they stood in the yard between the house and the old barn that Jacob's grandfather had built 70 years ago. The front door burst open and Martha rushed out, her face a mixture of relief and fury. "Jacob Miller," she shouted, "where in God's name have you been? I've been worried sick." She stopped abruptly when she saw the enormous black horse standing in the shadows behind her husband. Her mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. "What on earth is that?" she finally managed to ask, her voice rising an octave. "Jacob, tell me you didn't." Jacob stood in the yellow light spilling from the farmhouse, still holding the rope attached to the massive black horse, while Martha stared at both of them with an expression that cycled rapidly through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been despair. Her gray hair had come loose from its usual bun, and her apron was stained with flour from the bread she had probably stress-baked while waiting for him to come home. Jacob knew he looked like a madman, covered in dust and sweat, his flannel shirt torn at the shoulder from when the horse had spooked near Millbrook, his face gaunt with exhaustion. But he also knew he couldn't explain what he had done in any way that would make sense to her. "Martha," Jacob began, his voice rough from hours of talking to the horse, "I know this looks bad. I know we can't afford this. But I had to." The word sounded hollow even to his own ears, a poor excuse for the decision that had cost them their last $7. Martha's face hardened, and Jacob saw her hands clench into fists at her sides. "Had to," she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "We have $17 in the bank, Jacob. $17 between us and losing this farm. The mortgage payment is due in 2 weeks, and we don't have it. We've been eating cornmeal and beans for a month, and you had to buy a horse." The horse shifted nervously behind Jacob, responding to the tension in Martha's voice. Jacob held up one hand in a placating gesture while keeping his grip on the rope with the other. "Just let me get him settled in the barn," he said softly. "Then we can talk." "Please, Martha." She looked like she wanted to argue, wanted to unleash the full force of her fear and frustration, but something in Jacob's eyes stopped her. After 40 years of marriage, she knew him well enough to recognize when he was operating on something beyond logic. With a sharp nod, she turned and walked back into the house, the screen door slamming behind her with enough force to make the horse jump. Jacob led the horse toward the barn, which loomed dark and silent in the night. The structure was mostly empty now, the dairy cows sold off 2 years ago, the chickens reduced to a handful that barely produced enough eggs for their own breakfast. The building creaked and groaned in the wind, and Jacob could smell the musty scent of old hay and abandonment. He pulled open the heavy sliding door, and it scraped across its track with a sound like a scream. The horse reared back, pulling against the rope, his eyes rolling white in the darkness. Jacob spoke in that same calm voice he had been using all day, coaxing the animal forward one step at a time into the barn. The interior was pitch black, and Jacob had to feel his way along the wall to find the old lantern he kept hanging by the door. His hands shook as he lit it, and the warm glow pushed back the shadows, revealing rows of empty stalls. He led the horse to the largest one at the far end, the one that used to house Bessie, their prize Holstein, before she had died of old age last spring. The stall still had fresh straw in it, something Jacob maintained out of habit, even though there were no animals left to use it. Getting the horse into the stall proved to be another test of patience. The enclosed space terrified him, and he balked at the threshold, snorting and backing up. Jacob didn't force it. He simply stood at the entrance, talking quietly, painting a picture with words of safety and rest. He described how soft the straw would be, how the walls would protect him from the wind, how no one would hurt him here. 20 minutes passed before the horse took that first tentative step inside, then another. Then he was in, and Jacob quietly closed the stall door, making sure to leave the top half open so the horse wouldn't feel trapped. Jacob found an old bucket and filled it with water from the pump outside, his arms trembling with fatigue as he worked the handle. He brought it to the stall and set it in the corner, watching as the horse eyed it suspiciously. The animal was clearly thirsty after their long walk, but fear won out over need, and he stayed pressed against the far wall. Jacob understood trust would come with time, if it came at all. He managed to locate a few flakes of hay in the loft, dusty and probably a year old, but it was something. He tossed them into the stall and stepped back. Before leaving the barn, Jacob stood outside the stall for a long moment, just watching the horse. The animal was watching him too, those dark eyes still wary, but perhaps a shade less terrified than they had been hours ago. Jacob realized he hadn't even asked what the horse's name was, hadn't thought to look at any paperwork. Not that it mattered. Whatever name the horse had been given in his previous life was probably associated with pain and failure. This was a fresh start for both of them if they could survive it. "I'll call you Midnight," Jacob said quietly, "because you came into my life in the darkest hour, and somehow that feels right." The walk from the barn to the house felt longer than the entire 10 miles from the auction. Jacob's legs barely carried him, and he had to pause twice to catch his breath. When he finally pushed through the kitchen door, he found Martha sitting at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, and Jacob saw that she had been crying. He sank into the chair across from her, suddenly too exhausted to even think about defending his actions. Martha spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me this is going to be okay, Jacob. Tell me you haven't just sentenced us to ruin." Jacob wanted to reassure her, wanted to promise that everything would work out, but the words caught in his throat. He was a farmer, a practical man who dealt in tangible things like soil and seasons and hard work. He had no business making promises about a situation that defied all logic. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was something he hadn't expected. "I can't tell you it's going to be okay," he said slowly. "All I can tell you is that when I saw that horse, I saw myself broken and scared and convinced that the world had no use for me anymore. And I couldn't walk away from that." Martha's tears flowed freely now, and she reached across the table to take his weathered hand in hers. "Oh, Jacob," she whispered, "what are we going to do?" Jacob woke before dawn the next morning, his body aching from the previous day's exertion. Martha was already up, moving quietly around the kitchen in the pre-dawn darkness. She had set out a meager breakfast of cornbread and black coffee, and when Jacob sat down at the table, she placed a hand on his shoulder without speaking. It was her way of saying that while she didn't understand his decision, she would stand by him. That silent gesture of support meant more to Jacob than any words could have expressed. He ate quickly and headed out to the barn, carrying a bucket of water and what little grain he had been able to scrape together from the nearly empty feed bin. The morning air was crisp and cold, his breath forming clouds in the darkness. When he slid open the barn door, he half expected to find the stall empty, the whole experience revealed as some fever dream brought on by stress and desperation. But Midnight was there, pressed into the far corner of the stall, his magnificent body trembling. The water bucket Jacob had left the night before sat untouched, and the hay remained scattered on the floor, uneaten. Jacob's heart sank, as he realized the horse had been too frightened to eat or drink all night. Dehydration and starvation could kill an animal as quickly as any injury, and Midnight was already showing signs of distress. His coat had lost some of its sheen, and his breathing seemed labored. Jacob knew he had to get food and water into the horse soon. But how could he help an animal who was too terrified to accept even the most basic care? He set down the fresh bucket and the grain, then did the only thing he could think of. He sat down in the straw outside the stall and began to talk. The sun rose while Jacob sat there painting the barn's interior in shades of gold and amber. He talked about everything and nothing, his voice becoming the soundtrack to Midnight's morning. He talked about the farm, about the creek where he used to fish as a boy, about the first time he had met Martha at a county dance 50 years ago. He talked about their son, Michael, who had left for the city 20 years ago and rarely called anymore. He talked about the weight of inherited dreams and the pain of watching them crumble. And slowly, incrementally, Midnight's breathing began to calm. By mid-morning, Jacob noticed the horse had moved slightly away from the wall. It wasn't much, just a few inches, but it was progress. Jacob shifted his position, careful not to make any sudden movements, and continued his monologue. He told Midnight about the drought that had destroyed his corn crop, about the bank manager who had looked at him with pity when explaining the foreclosure process, about the sleepless nights when he lay awake calculating and recalculating numbers that never added up to survival. There was something liberating about confessing these things to a creature who couldn't judge him, couldn't offer hollow platitudes or empty reassurances. Around noon, Martha brought him a sandwich and a thermos of coffee. She stood outside the barn for a moment, watching him sit in the straw talking to a horse who refused to eat, and Jacob saw her wipe her eyes before she turned to walk back to the house. He knew she was struggling with her own fears about their future, but she trusted him enough to let him follow this inexplicable path. He ate the sandwich mechanically, barely tasting it, never taking his eyes off Midnight. The breakthrough came in the early afternoon, when Midnight finally approached the water bucket. Jacob held his breath, not daring to move or speak as the massive horse lowered his head and took a tentative sip, then another. Then he was drinking deeply, desperately, making up for the long hours of self-imposed deprivation. When he finally raised his head, water dripping from his muzzle, he looked directly at Jacob. It was a look of such profound vulnerability that Jacob felt his throat tighten with emotion. The horse had chosen to trust him, if only in this small way. Encouraged by this progress, Jacob slowly stood and approached the stall with a handful of grain. Midnight tensed, but didn't retreat. Jacob extended his hand through the bars, palm up, offering the grain. The horse stared at it for a long time, his nostrils flaring as he scented the food. Finally, with movements so careful they seemed almost reverent, Midnight stretched his neck forward and lipped the grain from Jacob's palm. The touch of those soft lips against his weathered skin sent a thrill through Jacob. This was connection, real and tangible. Over the next several hours, Jacob repeated this process, hand-feeding Midnight small amounts of grain until the horse had eaten enough to sustain himself. It was slow, painstaking work that left Jacob's arm aching and his back screaming in protest. But he didn't stop. Each small victory, each moment when Midnight chose trust over fear, felt like a miracle. By evening, the horse was eating hay on his own, though he still watched Jacob warily from the corner of his eye. That night, Jacob didn't leave the barn. He told Martha he wanted to keep watch over Midnight to make sure the horse continued eating and drinking. But the truth was more complicated. He needed to be there, needed to maintain the fragile connection they had built. Martha brought him blankets and a pillow, shaking her head at his stubbornness, but unable to hide a small smile. "You're going to catch your death out here," she scolded gently. Jacob just kissed her cheek and promised to come in if it got too cold. The barn was peaceful in the darkness. filled with the soft sounds of midnight moving in his stall and the rustle of mice in the rafters. Jacob wrapped himself in the blankets and leaned back against a hay bale, feeling more content than he had in months despite the uncertain circumstances. He dozed off and on throughout the night, waking periodically to check on the horse. Each time he woke, Midnight was a little closer to the front of the stall, a little more willing to acknowledge Jacob's presence. The second day followed a similar pattern. Jacob spent hours in the barn, gradually increasing his physical contact with Midnight. He was able to touch the horse's neck without triggering panic, to run his hands along the powerful shoulders and feel the muscles beneath. He discovered old scars crisscrossing Midnight's hide, evidence of rough treatment and failed training methods. Each scar told a story of pain, and Jacob felt his anger rise at whoever had damaged this magnificent creature so thoroughly. By the afternoon of the second day, Jacob felt confident enough to attempt leading Midnight out of the stall for the first time since arriving at the farm. The horse needed exercise and fresh air, needed to see that this new place held more than just four walls and a pile of straw. But as Jacob opened the stall door, he felt his own nervousness rise. Inside the confined space of the barn, Midnight's size was impressive. Out in the open, with room to run, that size could become dangerous if the horse panicked. Jacob clipped a lead rope to the makeshift halter he had fashioned from soft cotton rope, deliberately avoiding anything that resembled the harsh equipment Midnight had undoubtedly experienced in his past. The horse's ears flicked back and forth, registering uncertainty, but he didn't resist as Jacob gently tugged on the rope. One step, then another, and they were moving through the barn toward the open door. The bright afternoon sunlight streamed in, creating a rectangle of golden light that looked almost celestial. Midnight stopped at the threshold, his entire body going rigid. Jacob understood the hesitation. This doorway represented a transition from known to unknown, from the relative safety of confinement to the vast uncertainty of the world beyond. He gave the rope plenty of slack and simply stood beside Midnight, letting the horse take his time to process. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Jacob heard Martha call from the house asking if everything was all right, and he waved to her reassuringly. Everything was more than all right. This moment of hesitation meant Midnight was thinking, weighing his options, making a choice rather than simply reacting in blind panic. When Midnight finally stepped through the doorway, it was with the cautious deliberation of someone crossing a threshold they could never uncross. The horse emerged into the farmyard, his head high, his nostrils flaring as he took in the scents of this new environment. Jacob led him slowly toward the pasture, a 5-acre field that had once held the dairy herd, but now stood empty except for wild grass and a few scattered apple trees. The fence was old but still sturdy, and Jacob had spent the morning walking the perimeter to ensure there were no dangerous gaps or loose boards. Opening the pasture gate proved to be another challenge. The squeak of the hinges sent Midnight skittering sideways, pulling against the rope Jacob held firm but gentle, using his voice to calm the frightened animal. "It's just a gate, boy," he murmured. "Nothing but wood and metal. Can't hurt you." The words were simple, almost silly, but the tone carried all the reassurance Jacob could pour into it. Midnight's ears swiveled toward him, processing the sound if not the meaning. Once inside the pasture, Jacob faced a critical decision. Should he release Midnight or keep him on the lead rope? A horse this size could easily jump or break through the fence if he wanted to escape, and Jacob had no way to chase him down if he bolted. But keeping him confined to a rope seemed to defeat the purpose of bringing him out here. Trust had to work both ways. If Jacob expected Midnight to trust him, he had to demonstrate his own faith in return. With hands that trembled slightly, Jacob unclipped the lead rope. For a long moment, Midnight stood absolutely still, as if he couldn't quite believe he was free. Then, with a suddenness that made Jacob's heart jump, the horse exploded into motion. He galloped across the pasture, his massive hooves tearing up chunks of earth, his mane and tail streaming behind him like black flags. He ran with a wild joy that was breathtaking to witness, running simply for the sake of movement, of freedom, of being alive. Jacob watched with his heart in his throat, terrified that Midnight would keep running right through the fence and disappear into the Kentucky hills. But Midnight didn't run away. When he reached the far end of the pasture, he wheeled around and galloped back, crossing the field in great powerful strides that showcased the incredible athleticism hidden beneath all that fear. He ran in circles, in figure eights, in random patterns that seemed to follow no logic except the pure expression of energy too long suppressed. Jacob stood in the middle of the field, turning slowly to keep the horse in sight, marveling at the transformation. This was what Midnight was meant to be. Not a terrified creature cowering in a corner, but a magnificent animal in full possession of his power. After 20 minutes of this explosive activity, Midnight began to slow. His gallop became a canter, then a trot, then finally a walk. He circled Jacob several times, gradually tightening the circles until he was close enough to touch. Then, in a gesture that brought tears to Jacob's eyes, Midnight walked right up to him and lowered his massive head, resting it against Jacob's chest. The weight was considerable and Jacob had to brace himself to support it, but he wrapped his arms around the horse's head and held on, feeling the rapid beating of Midnight's heart begin to slow and synchronize with his own. They stood like that for a long time, man and horse, bound together by something neither could fully understand. Jacob felt the dampness of Midnight's breath against his shirt, felt the warmth of the horse's body radiating through the cool air. This was trust in its purest form, freely given, without coercion or force. Midnight had chosen to come to him, had chosen to seek comfort and connection despite everything he had endured. It was a gift beyond price. The rest of the afternoon passed in a peaceful haze. Midnight grazed on the pasture grass while Jacob sat under one of the apple trees watching. The horse never strayed far, always keeping Jacob within sight, as if he needed the constant reassurance of that presence. When Jacob stood up and began walking toward the gate, Midnight followed without needing to be led. They walked back to the barn together, side by side, and when Jacob opened the stall door, Midnight went inside without hesitation. That evening, Jacob joined Martha for dinner in the house for the first time since bringing Midnight home. She had made a simple stew from vegetables grown in their garden, stretching what little meat they had to make it go further. As they ate, Jacob told her about Midnight's run in the pasture, about the moment when the horse had pressed his head against his chest. Martha listened quietly, her expression softening as she watched the animation in her husband's face. "I haven't seen you look this alive in years," she said finally. The third morning dawned with an unexpected chill in the air, the kind that warned of an early winter coming to the Kentucky hills. Jacob rose even earlier than usual, driven by an urgency he couldn't quite name. His sleep had been restless, filled with fragmented dreams of running horses and empty fields. When he looked out the bedroom window toward the barn, everything appeared peaceful in the gray pre-dawn light, but something felt different. The air itself seemed charged with potential, as if the universe was holding its breath. Martha was already in the kitchen when he came downstairs, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the small room. She poured him a cup without speaking, but Jacob noticed her hands trembled slightly as she set it on the table. "We got a letter yesterday," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral from the bank. Jacob felt his stomach drop. He had been so consumed with Midnight that he had almost managed to forget about their financial crisis. Almost, but not quite. The worry had been there all along, lurking beneath every moment of connection with the horse, a dark undercurrent threatening to pull them both under. He opened the envelope with hands that had steadied themselves through decades of hard work and harder times. The words were exactly what he had expected, but somehow still devastating to see in black and white final notice. 30 days to bring the account current or face foreclosure proceedings. The amount due seemed impossibly large, a sum that might as well have been $1 million for all the chance they had of raising it. Jacob set the letter down on the table and looked at Martha, seeing his own fear reflected in her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She shook her head, reaching across to take his hand. "You have nothing to be sorry for. We've done our best. Sometimes best isn't enough." But even as she spoke these words of acceptance, Jacob saw the grief in her face. This farm was more than just property. It was her entire adult life, the place where she had raised their son, where she had buried 3 babies who hadn't survived infancy, where every room and field held memories both precious and painful. Losing it would be like losing a piece of themselves. Jacob drank his coffee in silence, his mind racing through options he had considered and rejected 100 times before. They could try to find work in town, but at their age, who would hire them? They could ask Michael for help, but their son had his own struggles in the city and barely made enough to support his own family. They could sell off more equipment, but they had already sold anything of value. The situation was hopeless, and Jacob had known it for months. The only thing that had changed was that now they had a specific deadline for their ruin. When he finally headed out to the barn, the sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. The beauty of it mocked him somehow, the indifference of nature to human suffering. He found Midnight already awake and waiting at the front of the stall, his large, dark eyes tracking Jacob's movements with an alertness that suggested the horse had sensed his distress. Animals always knew, Jacob reflected. They could read the subtle changes in body language and scent that humans tried so hard to hide from each other. Jacob went through the morning routine mechanically, bringing fresh water and grain, mucking out the stall. But his movements lacked their usual purposeful grace, and Midnight responded to the change by becoming skittish again, moving to the back of the stall and regarding Jacob with renewed wariness. The horse's reaction only deepened Jacob's despair. Even this fragile connection he had built over the past 2 days felt like it was slipping away, crumbling like everything else in his life. He led Midnight out to the pasture but didn't stay to watch him as he had the previous day. Instead, Jacob walked to the far corner of the property where an old oak tree stood sentinel over his father's grave. The headstone was simple, just a name and dates, but Jacob had spent countless hours here over the years, seeking guidance from a man who had been gone for 20 years. His father had built this farm from nothing, had weathered the Depression and 2 wars, and emerged with his land and his dignity intact. What would he think of his son now, about to lose everything through a combination of bad luck and poor decisions? Jacob sat down with his back against the tree and let the tears come finally. All the grief and shame and exhaustion he had been holding back. He cried for his failed farm and his dwindling hope. He cried for Martha, who deserved so much better than what he had been able to provide. And he cried for Midnight, that magnificent damaged creature who had somehow stumbled into Jacob's life just in time to witness its complete collapse. What had he been thinking, spending their last $7 on a horse? It was the act of a madman, a desperate fool grasping at meaning in the face of inevitable defeat. The sun climbed higher, and Jacob remained under the oak tree, lost in his dark thoughts. He didn't hear Martha approach until she was standing right beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "You need to see this," she said quietly, and something in her tone made Jacob look up. She was pointing toward the pasture where Midnight stood at the fence line, his head high, his entire body radiating tension. But the horse wasn't looking at them. His attention was focused on something beyond the fence, something Jacob couldn't see from where he sat. Jacob stood slowly, his joints protesting after sitting on the cold ground for so long. He followed Martha's gaze and felt his breath catch in his throat. A small crowd had gathered on the road that ran past their property. Not just neighbors, but people Jacob didn't recognize. Some with cameras, others just standing and staring. At the center of the group was a man in an expensive suit, clearly out of place in this rural setting, gesturing animatedly as he spoke to the others. Martha's face was pale. "That man came to the door about an hour ago," she explained. "He wanted to see the horse. I told him you were busy, but he wouldn't leave. He said he's been looking for Midnight for months." Jacob felt ice form in his stomach. "Looking for him? Why?" Martha's expression was unreadable. "He says Midnight's real name is Dark Thunder. He says that horse is worth over $200,000. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, impossible and yet terrifyingly real. $200,000. The number was so large it became abstract, meaningless. Jacob couldn't even properly imagine what that much money looked like, let alone what it could mean for their situation. It would save the farm 10 times over, would clear every debt, would give them security for the rest of their lives. And all he would have to do was give up the horse he had owned for barely 3 days. Jacob walked toward the fence line where the crowd had gathered, Martha following close behind. The man in the suit saw them approaching and immediately stepped forward, extending his hand with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to making deals. "Mr. Miller, I presume," the man said, his smile broad and seemingly genuine. "My name is Richard Thornton. I'm a bloodstock agent, and I've been searching for that horse for the past 6 months." Jacob shook the offered hand mechanically, his mind still reeling. "Bloodstock agent," he repeated. "I don't understand." Thornton's eyes gleamed with the fervor of a true believer as he launched into his explanation. "That horse, Mr. Miller, is Dark Thunder, one of the most promising racing prospects to come out of Calumet Farm in a decade. His bloodlines are impeccable, his speed exceptional. He was being groomed for the Kentucky Derby when something went wrong during training. He injured a groom badly, hospitalized another trainer. The owners declared him too dangerous and sold him off at a loss, trying to recoup at least something before he killed someone. But I've been following his trail because I knew there was potential there if someone could just reach him." Jacob felt sick as he listened. The expensive trainers, the rough treatment, the parade of people trying to break Midnight's spirit through force, it all made horrible sense now. This wasn't just any horse. This was an animal who had been expected to perform at the highest levels, to be a champion, and when fear had made that impossible, he had been discarded like a piece of broken machinery. The people who had owned him hadn't seen a living creature in need of understanding and patience. They had seen a failed investment, and now this man wanted to take him, wanted to try again where others had failed. Thornton must have sensed Jacob's hesitation because he pressed on, his voice taking on a persuasive tone. "I watched you with him yesterday, Mr. Miller. I stood on that hill over there and watched you lead him to pasture, and I saw something remarkable. That horse trusted you. In 3 days, you accomplished what a dozen professional trainers couldn't manage in 6 months. You have a gift." Jacob shook his head slowly. "I don't have a gift. I just have time and patience, neither of which costs anything." Thornton's smile widened. "Exactly. That's exactly what Dark Thunder needs, and I'm prepared to make you an offer that reflects both the horse's value and your unique ability to work with him. I'll pay you $200,000 for the horse. But more than that, I want to hire you to continue his training. Come work at my facility in Lexington, full salary, housing provided, complete control over Dark Thunder's rehabilitation. You could save your farm and keep working with the horse." The offer was dizzying in its generosity, so perfect it felt like a trap. Jacob looked at Martha, saw the hope warring with suspicion on her face. This was everything they needed, handed to them on a silver platter. But something about it felt wrong, and Jacob couldn't quite put his finger on what. "Why me?" he asked finally. "You could hire any number of professional horse trainers with better credentials and more experience. Why would you want an old farmer who barely knows one end of a thoroughbred from the other?" "Because those professionals have failed," Thornton replied smoothly. "Because what Dark Thunder needs isn't technical expertise. He needs someone who sees him as more than a commodity, more than a potential winner." He needs someone who cares. And in 3 days, Mr. Miller, you've demonstrated that you care more about that horse than anyone I've encountered. Jacob wanted to believe him, wanted to accept this miraculous solution to all their problems, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something Thornton wasn't saying. The crowd that had gathered was growing larger, people drawn by the spectacle of fancy cars and expensive suits in their quiet corner of the world. Jacob recognized some of his neighbors, saw the speculation in their eyes as they tried to piece together what was happening. Tom Henderson from the next farm over caught Jacob's eye and gave him a questioning thumbs up, clearly wondering if this meant good news. Jacob couldn't respond because he didn't know the answer himself. "Can I think about it?" Jacob asked finally. Thornton's smile never wavered, but something flickered in his eyes, a flash of impatience quickly suppressed. Of course, take your time. Of course. Though I should mention that I have another potential buyer coming this afternoon, a man from Dubai who collects problem horses. He's prepared to match my offer, though I doubt he would be interested in retaining your services. The implication was clear. This was a limited-time offer, and Jacob needed to decide quickly. Martha squeezed Jacob's arm, a subtle gesture that he understood immediately. They needed to talk privately, needed to weigh this impossible decision without an audience. "If you'll excuse us," Jacob said to Thornton, "I need to discuss this with my wife. We'll have an answer for you by this afternoon." Thornton nodded graciously. "I'll be at the Millbrook Inn if you need to reach me. But Mr. Miller, don't wait too long. Opportunities like this don't come around twice." As the crowd began to disperse and Thornton drove away in his luxury sedan, Jacob and Martha walked back toward the house in silence. The morning that had started with such despair had transformed into something else entirely, but Jacob wasn't sure if it was hope or just a different flavor of disaster. They sat at the kitchen table, the bank's foreclosure notice still lying where Jacob had left it, a stark reminder of what was at stake. "We have to sell him," Martha said finally, her voice heavy with resignation. "Jacob, I know you've bonded with that horse, but we can't let sentiment destroy us. This is the answer to our prayers." Jacob nodded slowly, knowing she was right, but when he closed his eyes, all he could see was Midnight's face, the trust in those dark eyes, the way the horse had rested his head against Jacob's chest. That wasn't sentiment. That was something real, something that couldn't be measured in dollars. Jacob spent the rest of the morning in a fog of indecision, moving through his chores without really seeing them. Martha had gone into town to call Michael from the general store, wanting their son to know about the offer before they made any final decisions. Jacob knew what Michael would say. His son was practical, grounded in the reality of numbers and consequences. He would tell them to sell, to take the money and the job, to stop being foolish about a horse they had known for less than a week. And Michael would be right. Jacob knew that. But knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were two different things entirely. Around noon, Jacob walked out to the pasture, where Midnight was grazing peacefully in the autumn sun. The horse looked up at his approach, ears pricked forward in recognition. There was none of the fear that had characterized their first encounters, none of the wild-eyed panic that had made everyone at the auction believe he was irredeemable. In just 3 days, Midnight had transformed from a dangerous, broken animal into something approaching normal. Not fixed, not completely whole, but healing. Jacob climbed over the fence and walked across the field, and Midnight met him halfway. Nickering softly and greeting, Jacob buried his face in the horse's mane, breathing in the warm smell of him, feeling the solid reality of muscle and bone and life. "I don't know what to do," he whispered into that black mane. "Everyone's telling me to let you go, and they're probably right. You could have a better life than what I can give you here. Better food, proper training, a real future. But the thought of handing Midnight over to strangers, even well-meaning ones, felt like betrayal. This horse had given Jacob his trust, something precious and hard-won, and Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that selling him would violate that gift in some fundamental way. They stood together in the pasture for a long time, man and horse, both lost in their own thoughts. The sun was warm on Jacob's back, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the faint sound of Martha's car returning from town. Soon he would have to make a decision, would have to choose between practical necessity and an emotional bond he barely understood. The weight of it pressed down on him until he felt he could barely breathe. It was Midnight who sensed the danger first. The horse's head jerked up suddenly, his entire body going rigid with alertness. His ears swiveled toward the road, and a low rumble emerged from his chest, not quite a whinny, but something more primal. Jacob turned to follow the horse's gaze and saw Martha's old sedan coming up the driveway. But something was wrong. The car was moving too fast, swerving erratically, and even from this distance Jacob could see that Martha wasn't in control. Time seemed to slow down as Jacob watched the scene unfold. The car careened off the driveway and onto the grass, heading straight for the deep irrigation ditch that ran along the edge of the property. Jacob started running, his old legs pumping as fast as they could, but he knew instantly that he would never reach her in time. The ditch was 15 feet deep with steep sides, and if the car went in at that speed, Martha would be lucky to survive the impact. He opened his mouth to scream her name, but the sound died in his throat. Midnight exploded into motion beside him, his powerful legs eating up the ground in great bounding strides. The horse ran like he had been born to it, like all those months of expensive training had finally found their purpose. He angled across the pasture, cutting a diagonal path that would intersect with the car's trajectory. Jacob watched in stunned disbelief as Midnight cleared the pasture fence in a soaring jump that would have done credit to any show jumper, his massive body sailing over the rails with inches to spare. The horse landed on the other side and continued running, positioning himself directly in the path of the runaway car. For one horrible moment, Jacob thought Midnight would be hit, crushed beneath the wheels of the sedan. But the horse planted his hooves and reared up, his front legs pawing the air, his massive body creating an obstacle too large to ignore. Martha, who had been fighting a steering wheel that had locked up, saw the horse and instinctively slammed on the brakes. The car skidded sideways on the grass, its tires throwing up clouds of dirt and torn vegetation, missing the ditch by mere feet, before finally shuddering to a stop. Jacob reached the car moments later, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. He yanked open the driver's door to find Martha slumped over the wheel, breathing hard, her face pale with shock. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands running over her arms and shoulders checking for injuries. She shook her head mutely, tears streaming down her face. "The steering locked up," she finally managed to say. "I couldn't turn, couldn't stop. I thought I was going to die." Midnight stood a few feet away, his sides heaving from the exertion of his sprint and jump. He was watching them intently, and Jacob could have sworn there was concern in those dark eyes. The horse had understood the danger and had acted without hesitation, putting himself at risk to save Martha. It wasn't training or instinct that had driven him to do that. It was something more, something that transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal. Jacob helped Martha out of the car, and together they walked over to Midnight. Martha, who had been skeptical of the horse from the beginning, who had questioned Jacob's sanity for bringing him home, reached out with a trembling hand and touched Midnight's neck. "Thank you," she whispered, and the horse lowered his head, accepting her gratitude with quiet dignity. Jacob felt something break open in his chest, some knot of tension he hadn't even known he was carrying. When Richard Thornton arrived at the farm that afternoon as scheduled, he found Jacob waiting for him at the gate. The bloodstock agent stepped out of his car with his checkbook in hand, and that same confident smile on his face. Jacob met him there and spoke before Thornton could launch into another sales pitch. "I appreciate your offer, Mr. Thornton. I really do. But Midnight isn't for sale. Not for $200,000, not for $2 million. That horse saved my wife's life today, and there isn't enough money in the world to make me give him up. Thornton's smile faltered, replaced by confusion and then irritation. Thornton's expression cycled through disbelief, frustration, and finally a kind of grudging respect. "Mr. Miller," he said carefully, "I understand you formed an attachment to the horse, but surely you can see reason. You're about to lose your farm. This money could save everything." Jacob nodded slowly. "You're right. We probably will lose the farm. But I've learned something these past 3 days that I had forgotten. Some things are worth more than property or security. That horse trusted me when he had every reason not to. I can't betray that trust, not even to save myself." The bloodstock agent studied Jacob for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether the old farmer was noble or simply insane. Finally, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "If you change your mind, the offer stands. But Mr. Miller, I hope you won't regret this decision when you're packing up to leave." Jacob took the card out of politeness but had no intention of using it. Thornton drove away in a cloud of dust, leaving Jacob standing alone at the gate. Martha was waiting on the porch when Jacob walked back to the house. She had changed out of her dirt-stained clothes and made tea, her hands still trembling slightly as she poured. "I thought you were going to sell him," she said quietly. "I thought that was the smart thing to do." Jacob sat down beside her and took her hand. Maybe it was the smart thing, but watching midnight save your life today, I realized that some decisions can't be made with the head alone. That horse gave us a gift today, and the only way to honor it is to give him one in return. His freedom, his safety, his chance to heal without being used. They sat in silence for a while, sipping their tea and watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. The bank notice still sat on the kitchen table, the deadline unchanged by their decision. In 30 days they would lose the farm unless a miracle occurred, but somehow the crushing weight of that reality felt lighter now. They had made their choice, and whatever consequences followed, they would face them together. The miracle, when it came, arrived in the most unexpected form. 2 days later, a young woman named Sarah Chen showed up at the farm driving a beat-up pickup truck. She introduced herself as a documentary filmmaker who had heard about Jacob and Midnight from someone who had been in the crowd when Thornton made his offer. Sarah explained that she was working on a film about the connection between humans and animals, about the bonds that formed in unexpected ways. She asked if she could interview Jacob and film Midnight. Jacob was skeptical at first, uncomfortable with the idea of cameras and attention, but Sarah was persistent and genuine, and eventually he agreed to let her spend a few days at the farm. She filmed Jacob working with Midnight, capturing the quiet moments of trust between man and horse. She interviewed Martha about the car incident, and her eyes filled with tears as Martha described how the horse had saved her life. When Sarah left a week later, she promised to stay in touch but gave no indication of what she planned to do with the footage. 3 weeks after that, Jacob's phone rang. It was Sarah, her voice crackling with excitement. The documentary had been picked up by a major streaming service. Not only that, but the story of Jacob and Midnight had resonated with viewers in a way she had never anticipated. Within days of the film's release, donations began pouring in from people around the world who had been moved by the story. Small amounts mostly, $20 here, $50 there, but they added up quickly. By the end of the first week, there was enough money to pay off the mortgage and cover the farm's operating expenses for a year. Jacob and Martha sat at their kitchen table, staring at the bank statements in disbelief. The money kept coming, accompanied by letters from people sharing their own stories of loss and redemption, of finding hope in unexpected places. A woman from Japan wrote about adopting a shelter dog after watching the documentary. A man from Brazil described how the film had inspired him to reconnect with his estranged father. The story of a poor farmer and a $7 horse had touched something universal, had reminded people that even in the darkest times, connection and compassion could create miracles. Richard Thornton called one last time, his tone different now, less commercial and more curious. "I saw the documentary," he admitted. "I understand now why you couldn't sell him. That horse didn't need a trainer or a racing career. He needed you." Jacob thanked him for understanding and quietly hung up the phone. As the seasons changed and winter gave way to spring, Jacob and Midnight settled into a routine that felt as natural as breathing. Every morning, Jacob would walk to the barn and find Midnight waiting at the stall door, eager to start the day. They would walk to the pasture together, and Jacob would lean against the fence while Midnight grazed, both of them content in the simple pleasure of each other's company. The farm slowly came back to life. With the mortgage paid and money for improvements, Jacob was able to plant again to repair the equipment that had fallen into disrepair. Martha started a small vegetable garden and began selling her preserves at the farmer's market. They would never be wealthy, but they had enough. More importantly, they had purpose. On quiet evenings, Jacob would sometimes stand in the pasture with Midnight and marvel at the strange journey that had brought them together. He had gone to that auction feeling like a failure, a man who had lost everything that mattered. He had spent $7, all the money he could spare, on a horse everyone said was worthless and dangerous, and that single act of faith, that moment of seeing past the fear to the wounded soul beneath, had transformed everything. Midnight was no longer the terrified, aggressive animal from the auction pen. He had become Jacob's partner, his friend, his reminder that redemption was always possible for those willing to offer trust. And Jacob, who had felt broken and useless, had discovered that he still had gifts to give, that his patience and compassion were worth more than any amount of money. Some might say that Jacob Miller had gotten lucky, that the documentary and the donations were a fluke that could never be replicated, but Jacob knew better. Luck was finding $7 in your pocket. Miracle was what happened when you spent those $7 on love instead of survival, on hope instead of despair. Midnight had given Jacob far more than he could ever repay. But every day he tried, and that trying had become the meaning he had been searching for all along.